Well, welcome to today's vlog, and I'm absolutely delighted that I have with me a very good friend of ours, Reverend Joy Langford. Joy is a minister in the Congregational Federation, which is a group of congregational churches, but also she's an authorised minister in the Methodist Church, and I've had the privilege of working with Joy for recent years, and it's a delight to have Joy with me. So thank you, Joy, for willing to have this faith journey conversation. So let's begin at the beginning, shall we? And tell us a little bit about your childhood and how that influenced your faith journey.
My childhood, well, I was the third of three children. I got two older brothers. As Steve might tell you, I'm probably as old as my hair and not quite as old, a bit older than my teeth or something ridiculous like that. I was born anyway in Cirencester in Gloucestershire. And my parents were both Christians. And so right from being very, very small, we were always brought up to go to church. Various different churches, but I do remember going to a Methodist church, I remember a Baptist church, all sorts, depending on where we lived. Because of Dad's job, we moved around a little bit. So we moved from Gloucestershire to Snettisham in Norfolk, and from there we moved to Leicestershire, to Desford. So 1965, we arrived in Desford, and we went to church at Desford in the morning and Kirby Muxlow in the afternoon and back to Desford in the evening.
Wow.
So we were it was busy. Sundays were always busy. And we lived out at Botcheston, which is kind of like the back of Beyond at the time. My father was a gardener. And then we moved to Markfield. Mum became a teacher, so we moved out of tied property and bought our first house. Mum and Dad bought their first house. And we moved into Markfield in 1972, I think it was. And we started to attend a church called Stanton de Baden. At that time, it was Free Evangelical Church. When I was 9, having been, taken to Sunday school all these years, I remember vividly being in an evening service and the lady preaching about God's yardstick and how none of us could measure up to it. And that was the night when I made my personal commitment to follow Jesus. And therefore, from there onwards, it was my decision to go to church, and that never ever waned. Teenage years and whatever anybody else did, I'm not afraid at all. It was kind of God's grace over my life. I think that I never went through a rebellious phase, and I was always the one.
Saved that for later years, did you, Joy?
Yeah, still going through that. I was the one who, as a kind of 13, 14-year-old, was at the prayer meeting and at the Bible study. Right. And I set up the Christian Union at school, and, that's who I was very much. I identify myself as part of a disciple of Jesus.
Brilliant. So, looking back over your kind of later years, growing up, adult years, what have been the significant moments or experiences in terms of your faith journey?
When I was probably about 14, around that age, I'm just trying to think exactly when it was, it doesn't really matter, but I was early teens, and I went to somebody's valedictory service, and they were going off to be missionaries in Vietnam, actually. Wow. And then from Vietnam they ended up in Indonesia, and I very remember a guy called Brash Bonsall being the preacher, and I just absolutely knew in my heart that I was going to be at some point in full-time service for God. I had no idea what that would look like. I just knew. And so from quite a young age, I had a real deep assurance that at some point I would be in full-time ministry. Also around the same sort of time, we were then attending an independent Pentecostal church in Colville. And that was when I came to understand more about the fullness of the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And as a 14, 15-year-old, it was not uncommon for me to have prophetic words in services, or, to feel a need to pray for people. And that's just who I was.
So how did the adults respond to that when you was just a teenager, had this kind of displaying this gifting of the Holy Spirit? How did the adults respond to that?
Two ways. Partly it was kind of, they were all so pleased because actually, this is one of theirs growing in the faith, and they really appreciated that. I think possibly looking back on it, they may have thought what a cocky little so-and-so I was, but I never felt that at the time. I always felt just totally encouraged by, what they were saying to me,
Right.
and by the prophetic words that they were sharing with me as well.
Yeah.
I didn't feel put down at all.
So talking about the prophetic words, God speaking through another human being into your life. So
Yeah.
has that been important for you in your own faith journey?
Different times in different places, yes. I've known times where people have, one example, for example, I was at a friend's wedding and I felt really quite a bit upset because there I was in my mid-20s and thinking, I'm on the shelf. And somebody came up to me and had a really direct prophetic word: Joy, the Lord's heard you cry and he wants you to know that you're not on the shelf. And they were the exact words that I had used when I'd been crying out to God. So yes, it has been deeply reaffirming and reassuring.
Yeah. So God is almost saying to you, look, I can hear what your prayers. I can sense what you're feeling in your heart, and I want to assure you. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. So tell us how things develop then into your adult years.
How do things develop from there? Well, I'll take you on two different journeys. The first journey, I'll tell you about my work life. I think I spent most of my teenage years going through secondary school in Colville, sure that I was going to be a doctor. Okay, I wouldn't say I'm not that intelligent. I think looking back, I probably am that intelligent, but I never applied myself to being able to do it. So when I left school, I really hadn't achieved a great deal in terms of academic qualifications, and the Lord led me, first of all, into nursing. And then one Sunday I was sat at church and somebody was preaching from Exodus chapter 1, and it says, remember the midwives of Israel. And it was just like the Lord just put this in my heart that I needed to become a midwife. So I went off, trained to be a midwife in Peterborough. A few hiccups along the way, not in terms of my training, but in terms of churchmanship and who I associated with, and had a bit of a problem there. Then I came back from there, and then I met a man.
Ooh.
A man.
Tall, dark, handsome stranger.
Yes. A blind date it was on Leicester railway station. I met him once, and I kind of put him in the car afterwards and went, phew, thank goodness. Well, I put him on the train and I got back in my car and went, oh, phew, thank goodness. And my dad said to me when I got home, he said, Joy, shame on you. I really thought I brought you up better than that. I said, what do you mean? He said, that poor young man, he made that journey all the way from Blackburn on his own on a train to meet you, and you're not prepared to get in your nice cozy car and make the return journey. And I thought, maybe he's got a point. So I decided to go on the return journey, and that was when the magic happened and we fell in love.
Brilliant.
Ooh.
And that's
and
John, husband, of course, your lovely husband.
My lovely husband, John. And John, at that time, was a congregational minister. And so I kind of joined him in the ministry, but I was still very much my own person, still working as a midwife. And then we moved to Leicestershire, where he became the minister at Narborough Congregational Church. And at that point, we started the family, we had children, and I gave up. I chose to stop working and to work alongside John in the church. But it was always a bit like the unpaid curate. So, I'm sure other people identify with this job function. Yeah. So I was doing everything. I was a worship leader. I was playing the piano for the services. I was not allowed to be a deacon. So I couldn't have any of that, but I was a youth leader. I worked in the Sunday school. I ran a lay Bible study. Everything there was to do, yeah. I was there in the midst of doing it all, as well as having the children. And that was very much the way we worked for a number of years. And then we moved to Shropshire. And while I was in Shropshire, I felt a real call of God to start training for ministry. And that, to me, felt a very natural progression. It felt like it was the appropriate thing to do. We were struggling financially. I won't go into it all, but we were struggling in a big way financially. And things were just getting worse. and I couldn't really see how it would all work out. So I started my training for the ministry. I did about 3 years, because at that time it was a 6-year course. I did the first half of it, and then I could sense that, this sounds horrible, but it is just what it was. I felt like John was taking a bit of a nosedive, and he was really not succeeding in ministry anymore. And I just really felt guilty about that. I felt as if I was almost rubbing his nose in it by going off and doing all this training. And so I stopped my training. And I just sat back and I thought, well, I can't do it. It's just not right. You know, why would I want to upset my husband like that? So for 4.5 years, I did all sorts of anything other than ministry. So I was still involved in the church where he was the minister, but I was also working in schools by then as a learning support assistant. And then we hit a real crunch, moved back to Leicestershire, and John didn't have a job anymore. And it was kind of in the midst of all that we went to a ministers' conference. John, not a minister, but the Congregational Federation had paid for us to go to conference. And while we were there, the Lord said to me, Joy, it's time now to take it back up again. And I went to go and see the director of studies, and I said to her, Janet, how far up my back do I have to twist your arm to let me back in? And she said, you're in. When you started.
Not very far then.
And then she said to me afterwards, and I had no idea at the time, but this is God's perfect timing. She said, you know what, Joy, you had got 1 month, because when academic study, you're allowed a break of up to 5 years for the current status to remain. If you don't resume studies within 5 years, you're back at square one.
Goodness.
And I had no idea. And I went back in, and then I carried on and completed my studies. So that was, very much God's hand at work in showing me his timing. So then I completed all my studies. I was still working at a school in Colville, learning support assistant, but actually I'd taken on all sorts of other job roles that I wasn't qualified for. And then I began doing a little bit of work at Markfield Congregational Church. In fact, it was at Markfield. I was preaching there one Sunday morning, and the guy stopped the service. He said, Joy, I've got to ask you something. He says, how come, this is Michael Hockaday, how come you've passed all of your exams to be a minister and you're not on the roll of ministers? And I said, well, you've got to have a church. They don't let you go on the roll without, we'll sort that out then. And so they created a job for me at Markfield to become the minister at Markfield Congregational Church. And that was where I actually first started in ministry. That was in 2013.
Yeah.
So I'm still their minister now, 7 years on.
That's brilliant. Joy, I think that would be a great time just to have a little break, call that part 1, and then we're all excited to go on to part 2 in just a moment. So we'll do that. We'll take a little break. So thank you. I've been really inspired by listening to what you've been saying so far. So look forward to what you're going to say next time.